Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Science Behind That podcast. I am Atticus Hamilton, and I hope you guys are having a beautiful Friday. I know I am having a great Friday. It is absolutely stunning here. It's a great day for all sorts of stuff, especially for another episode of the Science Behind That podcast. If you'll notice, this intro is a little bit different. This is just because this is a special episode today. Usually, we talk about the science of everyday life, but today, considering how many of you guys love my psychology episodes, we're actually going to be taking a look at several different psychiatric diseases and conditions, all of which are very odd and obscure, and we're going to be breaking them down and talking about them today. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Before we get started, I want to invite all of you, new listeners, old listeners, everyone alike, to go grab yourself a steaming hot cup of coffee and join me for today's episode of the Science Behind That podcast.
Welcome to the Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, everybody. Welcome on back. I hope you have yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee with you, because we are going to jump right into today's episode. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a longer episode, because today, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about 5 psychiatric conditions that y'all may never have heard of before. Conversion disorder, apotemnophilia, Capgras syndrome, trichotillomania, fictitious disorder imposed on self. So, before we get started, I'm sure there are a lot of you out there who really want to know where these diseases, where I found these diseases, first off, because I did a little research before this episode, and I also did a little research online, because I wanted to see what actually happened if you typed in rare psychiatric disorders, and I got a lot of weird stuff like top 5 diseases you've never heard of. And so at the end of the day, I went to my holy Bible, which is the Merck Manual of Diseases and Symptom Diagnostics, and looked under the psych section, and I kind of picked these 5 out of the list of many because they struck me as the most interesting. So, let's start with the one that I think is the most thought-provoking just from the name, which is conversion disorder. Now, way back when I first started studying for the MCAT, we mentioned conversion disorder in my behavioral science review, and when I first read it, I was kind of surprised because the actual term, the actual definition of the term is not at all what you think it would be. Conversion disorder is a weird psychological phenomenon characterized by a patient having real symptoms of a psychiatric illness like paralysis in the arm, blindness, deafness, etc., without any physiological cause. And I thought that, this was really interesting. When I read this, I thought this was really interesting because how can you have something like paralysis or blindness or deafness without physiological cause? And in all honesty, ladies and gentlemen, I don't really even think the medical community understands it to its fullest, because we really don't know how to treat it. And a lot of times we'll see patients come into the psychiatric emergency department or the emergency department generally with paralysis in the arm that suddenly happened. And after blood tests, after MBPs, after CAT scans and PET scans and CT scans, there is no, after MRIs, there's nothing wrong with the patient, and we don't really then know where to go from there. And this one always struck me because it always seemed like it was very closely related to our next disorder that we'll talk about, which is fictitious disorder imposed on self, mainly because I think these two blend really well together. But it always struck me as interesting because there's obviously something going on in these people, but there's no, obvious physiological cause for it. And the interesting thing is that it's always psychologically based symptoms: paralysis, hearing loss, blindness, etc. It's all things that could be attributed to the brain. And I don't know about you guys, but it's my personal theory that there is a physiological basis for it, but maybe the physiological basis isn't in the brain. Maybe it's somewhere else. Nonetheless, it is a very prevalent psychiatric condition, and surprisingly so, a large number of people are affected by it every year. And symptom-wise, we still don't really know how to treat it, because when there's no visible cause, what do? And so anyway, this kind of leads us into our second psychiatric condition, which is fictitious disorder imposed on self. Now, when I read this one, I kind of grimaced a bit, because this one strikes me as really, really similar to the last one in that they could be confused for each other. So this one is defined by a patient fabricating symptoms without any extrinsic motivator, which just means a person is fabricating symptoms and going to see multiple doctors for these symptoms that aren't there without any reason for doing so. And so here's a fun fact for all of you scientists out there, because I know that while all of you are scientists, maybe not all of you are doctors, which is totally fine because there's a lot of different types of science out there. But for all of you who are not ingrained in the medical community, there are two different types of data when a patient comes into the doctor's office that a physician will focus on. There's what's called subjective data and objective data. Now, do you guys want to guess what is considered subjective data? I'll take a break here so you guys can think about it. I have to sip my coffee anyway. So subjective data is the word of the patient, apparently, and things, primarily the word of the patient, honestly. It's non-test. It's things that cannot be tested, and it's things that cannot be touched. Now, what about objective data? So if you're anything like me, when I was first getting ingrained in this medical universe, you would say, well, wouldn't objective data be all the things that are testable and tangible? You would think so, but in addition to tests, there's one thing that is in objective data, which is the word of the physician. And this always struck me as kind of silly. So the word of the patient is considered subjective, but the word of the physician is considered objective? Because, even though, us doctors, and us pre-meds, even though we've gone to school for 10, 15 years, that kind of assumes that we're infallible, doesn't it? But anyway, so one of the big issues I have with this mental illness is the fact that it's basically saying that these patients are fabricating symptoms, they're fabricating symptoms, right? And so you have to ask yourself, well, how do you know they're fabricating symptoms? Because in the first illness that we talked about, which was conversion disorder, obviously the patient wasn't fabricating the symptom, but there was no physiological cause. You see what I'm saying? So how do you distinguish a fabricated symptom from maybe conversion disorder, or from plain and simple a symptom as a result of a disease that you have yet to diagnose? So this one, it struck me as interesting and unique, because this idea that it's a disorder characterized by fabricated, self-imposed symptoms without any external motivation to fabricate them. I don't know about you, but very few people like being in doctor's offices. I do, but just because I like the medical field, right? But like, nobody likes going to a doctor's office when you're sick. So this always struck me as kind of odd. And, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to put this one up to you guys to tell me what you guys think about this one. As always, if you have any comments about this, you can always shoot me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. I love to hear from you guys. And speaking of that, we're going to take a quick break here. Speaking of that, I've been getting a lot of emails from some of you saying that I should add a a support the show link in like the description. Some of you guys were also saying I should run ads on my podcast, but let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want, this to be a show that you tune into in the first 5 minutes. You're like, well, XYZ company sponsored today's episode. So tell me what you guys think of me adding a support the show link in the description, and if you guys would like that, or if you guys would prefer that to me running ads in my podcast, which I really don't want to do. Anyway, side note over. So that was number 2, and I really want to hear what you guys have to say about that one. Again, man, that one just leaves kind of a weird feeling in my stomach. It really does. I don't know. So the next one is one that I'm particularly interested in, which is apotemnophilia, which is a psychiatric illness that's brand new. I say brand new with air quotes because really it's just kind of newly named. It's not really brand new, but it's just been recently named, and it is defined by an intense desire to amputate a healthy limb. So let's think about that for a minute. An intense desire to amputate a healthy limb. So patients and physicians who have seen patients with this have described it as like an itching anxiety to amputate like an arm or a leg or a finger or whatever limb it may be. It's just like an itching anxiety that won't go away until the healthy limb is removed. And so in a minute here, we're going to explain what the cause is, or at least what new research suggests it might be. But what do you guys think it is? Because this one struck me as really interesting. I myself, being a microbiologist, I'm always inclined to say that it's something pathogenic, or that there's some microbiological characterization to this. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know. But according to recent research, it is hypothesized that apotemnophilia is caused by a dysfunction to the right parietal lobe, which results in a type of body dysmorphia targeted at one specific limb, inducing feelings of anxiety that are only satiated by the thought of amputation, or alleviated by the thought of amputation, which I think is kind of interesting to me. This one strikes me as quite a unique psychiatric illness that needs to be investigated further, I think. Apotemnophilia. All right. Well, moving on from that one, we have another psychiatric illness called Capgras syndrome. Now, before you guys are like, "Oh, Atticus, that's not rare," it is. It's just it kind of gained mainstream popularity after a few big YouTubers. I won't say who they are, but after a few big YouTubers did videos on them or on this particular illness, it kind of gained like a big traction of, well, everybody knows what it is, but there's a lot of misinformation surrounding it. So let's talk about what it actually is. So Capgras syndrome is essentially, it can be defined, a lot of people liken it to imposter syndrome, but it's not technically imposter syndrome because now, for any of you scientists out there who are still in college, you'll know what imposter syndrome is. It's a disorder characterized by a feeling that you shouldn't be where you are because you're not where you are because of you. You're where you are because of someone or something else. This is a little different. This is the perception. It's a illness characterized by an intense fear and anxiety and perception that a loved one in your life or somebody that you know very well is not who they say they are, which is really interesting. So patients with this particular delusion will report that they feel like their wife, for example, is not actually their wife and that she's an imposter and she's doing a really good job at trying to be like the patient's wife, but is not actually the patient's wife or whatnot. A funny example I could think of for this is if you guys have ever seen the movie Family Man. There's a scene in the movie Family Man where the little girl thinks that Nicolas Cage isn't her dad, even though he is. She thinks he's an alien. And I rewatched that not too long ago, and I thought, that is actually a pretty good example of Capgras delusion, which is just that. It's a delusion that your loved one or your close friends are imposters, and oftentimes it's associated with a feeling that they're imposters with an intent to harm you or to harm the patient. And so oftentimes we'll see patients in the clinical setting with this disease and a severe and such a severe anxiety around their good friends or their loved ones, in particular the one that they believe is an imposter, that they can't be near them, or they will hurt themselves because of it. And it's a really interesting psychiatric condition. So ladies and gentlemen, that leads us into the final one, which is called trichotillomania, which is a very interesting one. I had never heard of it until today, until yesterday. I'm recording this on Friday, and I had not heard of this one until yesterday when I was doing some research. It is a mental illness characterized by recurrent pulling out of one's hair, causing hair loss. The interesting thing with this one is patients who have this, they report a severe anxiety when they're not pulling out their hair, which is kind of interesting. And it raises a question, at least for me, of what is it about their hair that causes the anxiety and the desire to pull it out? You know what I mean? Like, there has to be something there. There has to be something there to make these patients say, yes, this is what I need to do. This is what has to be done. You know what I'm saying? So frequent and repeated pulling out of one's hair. Very interesting. Very interesting. And that kind of goes along. All of these kind of go along with a fundamental theory of psychology, which is that it's basically it's the escape learning theory, which is basically that all of our actions are to reduce the amount of unpleasantness in our life and increase the amount of pleasure in our life, which I think is pretty interesting. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our 5 odd psychiatric illnesses. Before we go, since, you know what, it is getting close to fall, and Halloween is my favorite holiday, I'm going to leave you with a fun experiment to scare your friends with. That is psychology related. And this is actually the origin of Bloody Mary. And some of you may have heard of this. It's called the Troxler effect. And the Troxler effect is an odd psychological phenomenon that occurs because our brains don't like to see the same thing over and over and over again. And so our brains, both under the law of similarity and the law of good continuation, which we could talk about later, they try and group. So the law of similarity says that our brains will try and group things that are similar one another together. And the law of good continuation says that our brains will try and group things that progress in tandem with each other together. And so what the Troxler effect is if you stare into the mirror at yourself at night in low light, but not completely black, just dark enough so you can barely see your face. So, like, here's what you do. Go into your bathroom at night, open the door, and in the opposite room, turn on a light. That will allow enough diffused light to reach you, but it'll still be dark enough for it to work. And if you stare at yourself in the mirror long enough, you'll notice it start to distort. You may even notice another person appear in the mirror, and that is because of the Troxler effect, which gets down more closely to the rule of good continuation and the rule of similarity. So, ladies and gentlemen, try that at home. Send me an email once you've done that, and send me an email and let me know what the what the results were of your little experiment. I would love to know. I'd love to hear. And with all that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all on Monday. Have a lovely Friday. Have a great weekend. And I will see you next time. Remember, stand up and question everything.